Thank you, Dr. Kovanets, and I'd like to thank Dr. Kovanets and the other organizers of the panel. I'm going to just give a very brief sort of introduction to why I'm here, sort of in terms of positioning, and then I'd like to discuss the topic today, which is this portrait here, called Ali. Okay. So I'm a sociologist who studies contemporary media practices, representations, and their effects. I do so primarily through ethnographic inquiry, by observing and interacting with people in their everyday environments, and participating in their use and creation of media as culture. I'm particularly interested in the transmission through media of cosmopolitan and cross-cultural notions. So my book, as the doctor said, is called The Amorous Migrant, Race, Relationships, and Resettlement, and it's coming out next year. And what it is a 10-year ethnographic study of post-2004 gay-identified Polish migrants to the UK, male Polish gay-identified migrants to the UK, considered through the lenses of race, sexuality, and computer-mediated communication. So the book explores the ways in which gay or queer male Polish migrants insert themselves into a racialized society, how they define themselves in the complicated language of self and other, love and hate, same and different, in culturally and racially plural Britain, and the role that media, such as the internet, play in this complex negotiation. The study led me to the topic that I wish to discuss with you today. So, in late 1949, August Agbola O'Brown applied for membership in the Society of Fighters for Freedom and Democracy in Warsaw. The society had been formed that same year out of the amalgamation of 11 pre-existing veterans associations and was state-run and state-controlled. O'Brown submitted the application form with all the requisite information filled in to identify himself personally, such as year and place of birth, July 22nd, 1895, Lagos, Nigeria, and place of residence at the time of the war, Ulica Złote. He also supplied information to describe his involvement in the war effort. He disclosed his code name, which was Ali. He specified the location of his operation, which was downtown, and the name of the battalion of which he belonged, which was Evo. His commanding officer, he wrote, was Corporal Alexander Marczynski, codenamed Wabich, Swan, which I find very nice. So the form remained undisturbed in the archive of the Society for Fighters for 60 years until 2009, when Dr. Zbigniew Oshinsky, an historian in the employ of the Warsaw Uprising Museum, uncovered it and pieced together a brief chapter on O'Brown entitled Insurgent from Nigeria for a book titled Africa in Warsaw, conceived and published by a foundation called the Africa Another Way Foundation. So newspapers wrote on this topic, picked up on this brief article. It's very, very brief, 3 pages, 4 pages, because the information, the archive was quite small, and that's going to be significant for what I'm going to talk about as we move forward. So, for instance, the Gazeta Wyborcza published a series of articles on the discovery, creating a minor sensation, literally. So one article, by way of describing O'Brown's absolute obscurity in the research compasses of Polish historians of the uprising, quoted a professor by the name of Komorowski, as stating, "If this is true, we have a sensation." So the sensation reached the artist Karol Radziszewski, who was inspired to create a heroic homage to the memory of Ali. Mr. Radziszewski is openly gay and has described himself as Poland's first openly gay or queer contemporary visual artist. His practice is multimedia, and he's well known for his installations challenging heteronormativity in Polish society, historically as well as, so he's in this process of kind of reclamation. So he's very interested in the archive and what the archive can render and ways in which, as he says, the archive can be queered. So this archive-based methodology crosses multiple cultural, historical, religious, social, and gender references. This is another image of O'Brown. As Hannah Zafiropoulos has written in the Calvert Journal, quote, "In 2005, Artist Karol Radziszewski founded Dick Fagazine, the first arts publication in Poland dedicated to the exploration of contemporary homosexuality and masculinity. 2005 was a crucial year for many reasons in Poland, as the right-wing political party Law and Justice won the election with a conservative agenda. Lech Kaczynski, then mayor of Warsaw and later president of Poland, banned the city's gay pride march. In the same year, an important gay novel, Love Town, mentioned this morning, by Michał Witkowski, was released, and Karol's solo show called Fags became the first openly homosexual exhibition in Poland. So against a backdrop of increasing hostility and often violent resistance towards homosexuality from nationalist and religious groups, Radziszewski has spent more than 10 years at this point researching and producing a growing archive of queer histories from Eastern Europe, a project which has become the center of his artistic practice. So that's a little bit of necessary background on the artist. So foraying into painting, we'll return to those images in a minute. Foraying into painting, Radziszewski created the series Ali between the years 2015 and 2017. One of these portraits, quote, found his place in the permanent collection of the Museum of Warsaw that opened last night, Mr. Radziszewski announced in a post on Instagram on May 24th, 2017. The selected portrait, which depicts Ali as a shirtless young man with massive bulging musculature, bears no resemblance beyond race to the archival photographs that exist of O'Brown. The real Ali was 49 years of age at the time of the uprising, married to a Polish woman. Another very interesting sort of footnote to this. It's actually not a footnote, but in the original piece that was written by Professor Oshinsky, he mentions that his belief is that Ali was born of a Polish mother. That information was never sort of like excavated any further, and so it just sort of is a line in this article. So anyway, so he was married to a Polish woman, father of 2 children. In every photographic representation, he is slight of build and fully clad in suits and ties. So, furthermore, immediately surrounding the portrait of Ali that was selected on the wall of the museum are, in the words of one commentator, portraits of white Polish men looking dignified in their military uniforms. In stark contrast, Radziszewski's Ali is literally stripped bare, a spectacle to behold. This is really a queer eye on the black guy, another observer expressed. These comments are drawn from social media and from informal conversations. So, this is the material I wish to make some critical observations about this particular portrait and its positioning, okay? So, from the perspective of what it attempts to do as an act of reclamation, as an artifact of representational art, and as a discourse on racial difference, particularly blackness, specifically black masculinity. So I interviewed Karol Radziszewski. That's us talking. I interviewed Karol Radziszewski by Skype on May 21st. We spoke for 2 hours. He was in his home in Warsaw, and I was in my home in New York City. It was, we joked, a transnational conversation in the digital age that brought into the present some of the themes of transnational intersection and convergence in the mid-20th century that the Ali series revisits. And we shared a lot, as you can see. That's the whole point of that collage, is that there was a lot that was going on during that conversation. A lot was exchanged. So I was concerned primarily about the representation of O'Brown with a bare chest, exaggerated African facial features, and a youthful 20-something air which contradicts the archival images of him at the time of his service as an older 40-something man, thin-lipped and narrow-nosed, with a not entirely remarkably athletic figure. I was concerned that the representation here was pornocentric, replaying a not unfamiliar trope of black masculinity, there's a global salience to the image of black masculinity as intrinsically hypersexual and hypermasculine, as my colleagues Brittany Slatton and Kamisha Spates are only the most recent scholars to explicate this theorem in a long tradition of scholarship and commentary that stretches back to at least the mid-19th century. Mr. Radziszewski told me, quote, I wanted to present him, speaking about Ali, like all this Polish representation of heroes, primarily. Like when you have the poet Juliusz Słowacki, please excuse my pronunciation. Yeah. National hero, perhaps you saw it, this big statue on the Bankowy Platz. In Poland, usually, heroes are with bare chests. Also, when you have the heroes of the Jewish Ghetto Uprising monument, they are also presented with the open shirt with the chest. It's like a heroic representation. So one in the Ali series, so these are the images that he's talking about, he's referring to. This is an image that I took in 2010 at Europride in Warsaw. The posterior, the behind of the statue to which he's referring. And this is the Warsaw Ghetto Monument statue that he's referring to. So, one in that Ali series, his objective was to, with the open shirt with the chest, he decided to paint one in that way. I'll go back to the, so you can follow along. He wanted to paint it in that way and use the Polish flag in the background. It also refers to this idea of the patriot, he said, who is a warrior and far from realistic. He said it's not a realistic representation. Like he is not in a uniform and in his 40s. Okay. So my focus here today, having said that, is on questioning the historiographic agency that this portrait exerts, both in terms of the representation itself, but also its positioning in terms of the exhibition. What history it tells the viewer. My argument henceforth is that the history that, that this portrait tells is not one of Ali himself, but of a collection of ideas, a set of discourses characteristic of a psychic operation in the production of culture to which, here she is, to which Toni Morrison, the African-American Nobel laureate, has given the descriptive term playing in the dark. Morrison's corner of interest in the realm of cultural production is, of course, literature. However, she's explicit about the process of ideation in which she's engaged. Quote, I would like to be clear at the outset, she says, she writes, that I do not bring to these matters solely or even principally the tools of the literary critic. So she's expanding, it's expansive. She's saying there's room here for us to talk about other forms of cultural and artistic production. Morrison goes on to explain that her awareness and her skills, her interpretative skills, are multiply informed by and from multiple subjectivities, lived social subjectivities, as well as artistic positionings. Not least of which is as a reader who takes seriously the very act of reading. Okay, so I adapt her concept of playing in the dark to advance a critical understanding of visual culture. So I also shift the scale of Morrison's work from one that is determined by influences and relationships that arise from within one national culture, that of the United States, which is primarily Morrison's focus, to one whose influences and relationships are swept and scattered across nations. Not unlike the little collage that I just showed you. Okay. So of playing in the dark, Morrison writes, there is a pervasive use of black images and people in expressive prose. Second, in the shorthand, the taken for granted assumptions that lie in their usage. And finally, the sources of these images and the effect they have on the literary imagination and its product. For Morrison, then, playing in the dark is built on what she calls an Africanist presence in American society, an Africanist presence, not African, but Africanist. And what she means by this Africanism, I'm going to take a minute to map out, and then we're going to move forward with the discussion of Ali. So she writes, I use the word Africanism or Africanist as a term for the denotative and connotative blackness that African peoples have come to signify, as well as the entire range of views, assumptions, readings, and misreadings that accompany Eurocentric learning about these people. Morrison proceeds to analyze selected texts from the American literary tradition, showing how black characters, situations, struggles, bodies, and relationships to whites are made to represent white fears, obsessions, and general notions about the world. Okay? From the sacred to the heroic, and from the profane to the abject. So it's a range, it's a continuum. So to this end, then, Morrison calls the Africanist presence in literature and cultural production more broadly a surrogate, an enabler. Okay, so she looks at this figure, this Africanist figure, whether it's a body or it's an idea or it's a situation, as this thing that enables an understanding, right? It's this kind of like conduit, like a surrogate. Okay, let's move forward rapidly. So she also makes the point that the United States is not unique in the construction of Africanism. She says South Africa, England, France, Germany, Spain, the cultures of all of these countries have participated and contributed in some sense, some aspect to an invented Africa. So, how can Africanism of the sort explicated by Morrison take form in Poland? I'll give you 3 suggestions. The first, Bronisław Malinowski. In the diary that Malinowski kept whilst conducting ethnographic fieldwork in the Trobriand Islands, in what is today Papua New Guinea, amongst people he termed Nigrami, and that's a lexically indeterminate term. People are not able to sort of define what the word means. Some scholars have translated it as meaning the blacks, and others argue that it means the niggers. He wrote longingly in his diary, quote, "A pretty, finely built girl walked ahead of me. I watched the muscles of her back, her figure, her legs, and the beauty of the body so hidden to us whites fascinated me. Probably even with my own wife, I'll never have the opportunity to observe the play of back muscles for as long as with this little animal. At moments I was sorry I was not a savage and could not possess this pretty girl." So, with that understanding, we also have to think about what type of Africanist influence is being exerted when we read this quote from Malinowski, where he writes, "We find magic wherever the elements of chance and accident and the motional play between hope and fear have a wide and extensive range. We do not find magic wherever the pursuit is certain, reliable, and well under the control of rational methods and technological processes. Further, we find magic where the element of danger is conspicuous. We do not find it where absolute safety eliminates any element of foreboding." My second example is, sorry, hitting the wrong keyboard here, is Ryszard Kapuscinski, who wrote very extensively about his understanding of otherness and difference. And so Kapuscinski, in this essay that he penned entitled "The Other," carries an introduction by a British scholar of Polish and Eastern European history named Neil Acheson. And Acheson writes, quote, "This author spent most of his life writing for a Polish readership, a readership isolated by the Cold War inside its own frontiers, which had inherited a traditional taste for otherness as a form of exotic entertainment. Kapuscinski, as this book shows, is interested in the way in which otherness is manufactured, in the way in which it is experienced and understood in the world. That said," Kapuscinski himself wrote, "Others, let us repeat, are the mirror in which I look at myself and which tells me who I am. When I lived in my country, I was not aware that I am a white man and that this could have any significance for my fate. Only once I found myself in Africa was I immediately informed of this by the sight of its black inhabitants. Thanks to them, I discovered my own skin color, which I never would have thought about alone. Others cast a new light on my own history for me," end quote. And my final suggestion is my own experience. The first time I visited the city of Krakow, this is not my photograph. I actually had photographs of this, but my hard drive crashed in 2009 and whatever. They're lost. But thank goodness somebody found it as interesting as I did, so I was able to pull this off the net. So the first time that I visited the city of Krakow in July 2008, a massive promotional billboard for the film Hancock starring the Black American actor Will Smith graced one side of the main market square. Smith's face gazed down at everyone passing through the main square, and everyone in turn stared up at it. So one afternoon, as I was crossing the bustling square, an adolescent boy of about 14 caught sight of me, and gesturing to get my attention, he pointed up at the image on the billboard and exclaimed to me passionately in English, "I love him. I love black." I wondered then about the inescapable element of race in that media display. How, by extension, were black people perceived and portrayed in Krakowian society and in Poland generally? This question preoccupied me and has led me here to discuss it with you. This was an overall issue of knowledge transfer, it seems to me. To whom and from whom do we seek knowledge? Where and how do those transfers occur? And where do we where do we think this knowledge is most relevant? So, this is another perspective. It looks like she's picking his nose. So to conclude, the problem, Mr. Rajaszewski told me during our interview, is that as a gay artist, I work a lot with homoeroticism, nudity, voyeurism, and it's always with white bodies. And I never thought about it because I work in Poland, so it was just that. Then in the States, I thought about it. Like, I'm a friend of Paul Mapagi-Sipuya, that's another artist that we both know, and I saw his work. For me, it was interesting, but I never photographed naked black men. For me, at that time, I just learned about it. He's referring to bodies of color. And then it was the first time it was possible to do work that way. And I was kind of stuck with the question, and the question he was stuck with, it seemed to him, was if I eroticize the gay black body, it is exoticization. But at the same time, if I'm avoiding any black body in my desire in the artwork, it is excluding this body from the representation. In Poland, nobody, and this is crucial, this last sentence, because it's going to pull us through to the conclusion. In Poland, nobody is working on that. For me, it's a dilemma. And, however, I wish to suggest that Mr. Rajaszewski is mistaken in that assertion. I wish to, carrying forth with this notion of knowledge transfer, there is a black Polonia, there is a black Poland, there is a black intelligentsia, there is a black set of cultural production that is taking place in Poland, to which there needs to be some sort of knowledge transfer, if you will. Need is a strong word. Could be. They ought to explore and examine the same challenge of knowledge transfer, to engage with the work and the perspectives of black Polonia. And these are some of the scholars and artists and journalists. Journalist Brian Scott of Radio RMF, FM Krakow. Dr. Omar Sangare, who's the author of Othello, Pale from Envy. Mamadou Diouf, who's a musician and founder of that Africa Foundation, what's it called? Africa Another Way Foundation, which is the organization that published the book which brought attention to Ali in the first place. And that's it. So in conclusion, I'd like to state that this paper makes ultimately a call for a cosmopolitanization of Polish cultural production and Polish studies, a transformation of the intellectual and cultural imagination into one that engages rather than objectifies blackness. Thank you so much for your attention.